Well, hello everybody, good evening. I want to welcome you here to the Covenant Church in Mead. My name is John Schnell and I'm the pastor. We are very happy that we're able to be the host site for this town hall meeting. And I need to do a, sort of a typical house cleaning order type thing that the views expressed here, we just want to say, may or may not be the views of Mead Covenant Church and its leadership. But we are very, very excited to host this and looking forward to all the information that's going to come out. And since Al said it'd be okay, I would like to offer prayer, if that's all right. Okay. Thank you, Almighty God. I bless you that, Lord, as we've prayed for, just for you to reveal things, I'm astonished of all the truth that's come out about this situation. And we know that these things have been revealed because you've used people, because you've used circumstances, and because you've just chosen to bring this out and to be our champion. So, Lord, I just pray that you'd bless this time, that everything spoken would just do you honor and do honor to your name. In Jesus, I pray. Amen. Amen. Amen.
Welcome. Very pleased to see so many people here tonight. I've just got a few little housekeeping things I want to run through first. First of all, we're going to have our presenters go through their presentations. Following that, we'll take questions from the audience. I think it'll just work better if we do it that way. But when you have a question, remember that this is being filmed through Facebook Live, so you'll need to come to the microphone to ask questions. And then the panelists will need to return to the microphone in order to answer those questions. So when we get to the question and answer part of it, if the panel could all kind of be up here close together, I think that would be good. There are snacks and drinks out in the lobby. The rule here is no drinks in here except water, so please observe that. I also want to thank, and I don't have a list of the many sponsors, but there are a number of sponsors and co-sponsors for this event who helped us to promote it, and I just wanted to give a shout out to those folks who have helped us make this issue. I'm Al Davis. I'm a former senator from Hyannis, Nebraska, served in the legislature from 2013 to 2016, and enjoyed that experience. Now I'm working for the Sierra Club in Lincoln, which is one of the co-sponsors here. I'm just going to go ahead and just start out. Jody Weible is the first speaker. She's just going to talk a little bit about what she's done and what she knows, and we'll then move on to the next ones.
Hi. As Al said, I'm Jody Weible. I live here in Mead. We moved here in 1986. Early 2018, we noticed just a horrendous smell. There isn't a way to describe it. Dead, rotten, sweet, acidic, all in one. And it was awful. And they're putting this stuff in the fields by our homes. I started calling, it was DEQ at the time. They know me now. When I call, they go, "Hi, Jody." I've called so many times. Usually they would say, "We don't know what to do. There's no legislation. We don't know what to do." And you keep calling and you keep complaining. I sent pictures of my neighbor's daughter's eyes. She actually had pus coming out of her eyes when they spread it in the field next to us. I just can't describe it. I've called Governor Ricketts. I've called every department in DEQ. I've called the Department of Ag. I've called the conservation people, EPA, anybody I could think of that would try and do something to help. And for 3 years, it's pretty much been a runaround. It wasn't until Carrie's article in The Guardian that people took notice and things have started to happen. I am so glad to see so many people here, and I'm hoping we can come together and resolve this and get it taken care of without any further damage to our environment. That's it.
I also need to say, for those of you who are from Mead and you want to participate and find out how you can facilitate and get active with this project, that Jody's the go-to person for that. So the next person who's going to talk is Paula Dyas. who's also from the area. I think most of you probably know her. She's going to just share a little of her observations.
My name's Paula Dyas. My husband Keating is sitting over there as well. We actually live on an acreage 3 miles north of Mead, Nebraska, and my story is very similar to Jody's. Yeah. And so in 2018, when they first started spreading the byproduct in the fields surrounding our acreage, all 3 of our dogs became violently ill that spring. And it took us a while to make the association, but it was directly related to eating the byproduct. Within 2 hours, they were just violently sick, and it lasted for about a week with each one of the 3 dogs. And so I started calling DEQ at the time, was sent to the Department of Ag, and no one seemed to have the answers. The byproduct was classified as a soil conditioner, and there was really no regulations on how much could be applied. When we first found out that it was being derived from treated seed corn, I got a little concerned. I have an agricultural background, and I knew that those things were regulated chemicals. So we actually took a sample and had it sent to Iowa State Vet Diagnostic Lab and found 7 pesticides and fungicide residues in there. 2019, spread again, dogs sick again. So that's how we got involved in this, and I think that we need to find a resolution. I think it's bad for the environment, bad for wildlife, bad for pets, and bad for people. Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce my friend Leesa Zalesky, who's a reporter and has worked for a number of newspapers. She's a darn good reporter. And Lisa's husband, Doug, works in the areas at the farm. Leesa, are you prepared to give him some history?
All right, I have a helper with us, pointer tonight. I was given 5 minutes to give you a 20-year history on the AltEn plant. Impossible job. So I'm going to hit the salient points, and then I'll be available afterwards to share research with you. This is a complicated and convoluted corporate structure. I'm sure that if there is media in the audience, you already recognize that because you probably tried to do the research. It's further complicated by the 2017 death of the founder of the company, Dennis Langley, and then a 2007 bankruptcy. Next slide. This should be a Google Earth view of the plant. It gives you a bird's eye view for those of you that aren't familiar with the layout of the plant and its location. Doug, if you would single out the feedlot for them. The feedlot is one of the enterprises. It's one of the components of the AltEn operation. There is a biochar unit for which they carved out 5.5 acres, which borders the feedlot and sandwiched by the feedlot and the ethanol production facility. And then there is the ethanol plant, which Doug will circle for you. There are lagoons. I'm told that the total lagoon capacity is 175 million gallons. Surrounding landowners, by my research, are largely 2 entities. One is the University of Nebraska, so it's Board of Regents, and the other is Rainier Holdings, which is Jeff Rakes. Next slide. This gives you the original plan. So the components of the closed loop system for ethanol production included the feedlot, which was going to supply the manure. And then ethanol was going to be created, fired by the methane gas created in the anaerobic digesters. They needed access to corn and transportation. The village of Mead offered it all for them. Local farmers, the whole ball of wax. There was already an existing 30,000, well, there was an existing feedlot which was expanded after the Langley Group took over. Next slide. The Mead plant, you need to understand, is a maze of LLCs, all connected to Management Resources Group and the Langley Group, founded by Dennis Langley, who was an energy and political from Shawnee, Kansas. I want to give you a little background about him. So he earned his Juris Doctorate, he's a lawyer, at Catholic University, and out of college he went to work on Capitol Hill as counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, and became chief speechwriter for the Judiciary Committee chairman, then Senator Joe Biden. Before he moved back to Kansas, opened a law firm, and then he purchased the Kansas Pipeline Operating Company. In Kansas, at the invitation of their governor, he became the state Democratic Party chairman, served as chairman for the Midwestern region of the Association of State Democratic Chairs, and eventually became the third longest serving member of the Democratic Party's National Executive Committee. Originally, Langley formed Earth, Energy, and Environment. Get it? 3 E's. So it became the holding company for E3 Biofuels, which was the original name of the Mead Ethanol plant, was E3 Biofuels. In fact, when I'm in downtown Wahoo and I bring up the plant, a lot of people still call it E3. They refer to it as E3. At the same time, Langley also acquired controlling interest in Mead Cattle Company. He, in fact, registered with the state of Nebraska Mead Cattle Company as a trade name for the feedlot back in the late 1990s. They often, in my research, I have found that all these LLCs use a corporate service company in Omaha as their registered agent. Intentional or not, it creates a hurdle when you're researching to have to get past. It's almost like a shroud for the actual identity of who's behind it. But you can get to it. Next slide. The original E3 Biofuels business model, which was declared in documents all over the place, including to the village of Mead, was an ethanol production facility, storage processing, pollution control, waste handling, shipping, sufficient to produce from corn. They didn't talk about seed corn. Approximately 24 million gallons of ethanol annually. Next slide. So this is the promise they made in writing. Again, it was in the documentation. 11 million bushels of corn was needed, along with other services and goods, and that would be purchased primarily locally. So for the people of Mead, it sounded great. Jobs, economy, a boost to the economy, growth. But reality struck when the plant went into bankruptcy in late 2007. And at least 16 local businesses and farmers were sued by the bankruptcy court to retrieve any proceeds paid to them by the plant during the previous 90 days. That sent at least one farmer in Ashland out of business. Next slide. The village of Mead formed a tax increment financing district to help finance to the tune of $5 million certain parts of the construction of the plant. In order to do that, the village of Mead had to annex, and they were limited to the number of acres that they could annex. They annexed 252.95 acres. They were limited to that because the village of Mead itself is not any larger than that. The village then had to subsequently declare that blighted and substandard in order to qualify. And let's not forget that part of the annexed property includes a portion of the feedlot. Next slide. So this is a Google Earth view of the outline. I've outlined on this map the annexed property. I hope that shows up for you. So the annexed property is considered Village of Mead limits. Externally, that's the Saunders County, under Saunders County control. Next slide. How am I doing on time? Am I okay? Okay. Okay. We'll move quickly. Slide 9, the timing is interesting. In June 2007, Langley held a ceremony at the Mead plant celebrating its construction. In attendance were plenty of politicians, everybody hungry for a camera, a microphone, including Nebraska Governor Dave Heinemann. 5 months later, Langley filed for bankruptcy protection in Kansas. The Kansas filing complicated things for local businesses who were, as I said, sued for retrieval of proceeds. They had to find legal representation license to practice not only in Kansas, but also in federal bankruptcy court. And because this bankruptcy was so big and involved so many entities, it was almost impossible for the little guy to find a Kansas lawyer that would fit the qualifications. A month after the bankruptcy filing, the Village of Mead board discussed things with its attorney, who told them that a future concern would be if Mead Cattle Company is sold because part of the feedlot land is now within village limits. That statement was prophetic because Management Resources Group is now actively courting a feedlot buyer out of Texas. Next slide. By 2010, a new LLC named AltEn emerged from the bankruptcy proceedings as the owner of the ethanol plant. When you dig deep enough, you discover that AltEn is really just a reorganized version of E3 Biofuels, with Langley and Management Resources Group still in charge. They did, however, according to multiple news reports, bring in new money from a private investment firm called Spectrum Business Ventures. That's run by and owned by Amit Raizada. Originally, Spectrum was located in Kansas, but has recently filed with the Kansas Secretary of State to relocate his firm to Florida. The business profile for Spectrum turns up citrus groves, wireless communications, laser hair removal salons, and a variety of other enterprises. The company promotes itself as a specialist in complex business opportunities, representing multifamily investors in the Kansas City area. Next slide. By the fall of 2014, Tanner Shaw, who is Dennis Langley's stepson, appeared before the Village of Mead board seeking building permits for 2 1 million bushel grain storage warehouses, and those were approved by the Village of Mead. He also informed the trustees that the plant would reopen soon, and they planned to process corn and milo. There is no recording in the minutes that he would have said they were going to process treated corn or milo seed. Next slide. By September 2015, the Village of Mead board was receiving regular and consistent complaints from citizens about the stench emanating from the plant, as well as concerns about their acute nosebleeds, chronic coughs, and respiratory issues, as well as the color and the smell of their tap water. Also in 2015, Village of Mead trustees requested a public hearing with NDEE regarding AltEn's newly proposed permit modifications, saying that trustees wanted NDEE to hear the citizen complaints. What we know from that is that in November 2015, that's my benchmark, Village of Mead trustees expressed concerns about, documentation shows that NDEE was informed as early as mid-2015 about treated seed corn being processed at the plant. At the same time, the Village of Mead trustees were concerned about AltEn's delinquent water and sewer account. Next slide. And let's go to the next slide. In 2020, a mass email was issued by AltEn to North American seed manufacturers soliciting their discard seed at zero cost to the manufacturer. That email states, quote, "The byproducts are all land applied under state of Nebraska EPA permit and allowance by USDA," end quote. There's plenty of evidence demonstrating that the stinking piles of pesticide-laden wet cake byproduct was being hauled by the truckloads to local farm ground for field application. Next slide. The AltEn email stated that the plant was receiving 98% of all discard seed in North America, and that the plant was under contract by all major seed producers, including Monsanto, Bayer, Syngenta, Dow Ag Reliant, and Land O'Lakes, and at least 100 others that they didn't specifically name. Next slide. The company email said the plant was seeking treated corn, wheat, and sorghum seed and would recycle or dispose of all other treated or non-treated seed, including soybean, barley, popcorn, rye, and all others. And by the way, that email references an AltEn warehouse located on Upland Avenue in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is near the Lincoln Airport. I believe this, based on my research, to be rented space and not owned by AltEn, but it would be interesting to know what they're storing in that rented space, in that warehouse. Next slide. In January 2021, The Guardian published the article on the plant, exploring the effect of treated seed processing on the community of Mead, the surrounding area, as well as the demise of bee and honey industry in eastern Nebraska. And then disaster came on February 12th in the form of a rupture on one of the plant's anaerobic digesters, resulting in a 4 million gallon spill that found its way into a stream bed and flowed downstream a substantial distance. And there's another detail I wanted to share that I discovered over the weekend. Via Nebraska Taxes Online, the plant is delinquent on its property tax bill to Saunders County for both 2018 and 2019, amounting to more than $400,000. And as you know, the first half of 2020 taxes are due in a couple of weeks. I'm told by a source at the courthouse that the county holds no hope that those taxes will be brought current. Next slide. And this I wanted to bring to you just so you could see the proximity of the Platte River. And again, this is for people who are here in the audience who aren't familiar with the lay of the land. So Doug is showing you the Platte River, and then Johnson Lake. There is a steady drop in elevation from the plant in a southerly direction. And last slide. Here's some questions I want you to ponder. Who made the decision? Who changed the business model to treated seed? And what agencies were informed? And what did those agencies do with that information? A second question, and this is one that's incredibly important in my opinion, is whether any testing for neonics or other pollutants has been conducted on the feedlot manure pits, soil, water sources, or watersheds. That feedlot produces food animals. And why in the world would local governments consider issuing conditional use permits, clearing the way for the sale of the feedlot without having the appropriate testing and research completed, or at least let the unprecedented team that UMMC has put together advise the county and the village of Mead about how prudent it is to issue a conditional use permit to that facility. It's very premature in my mind. But in fact, tomorrow morning, Saunders County Board of Supervisors will consider conditional use permit for Mead Cow Company at their meeting. Thank you.
Like I said, Lisa's a good reporter and a thorough one, and has done a lot of work to kind of bring us all up to speed. The next speaker is going to be Janice Molhoff, who's from Ashland. Janice has really been a key part of the organizing and the work that's gone into, I guess, the coalition that is presenting this event tonight. And she's got quite a history of her own, a retired colonel, is that correct? So thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Al. Denise Mulhoff. I'm a resident of Ashland, and I'm speaking tonight only for myself and not on behalf of any organization. Between 2016 and 2018, I studied water quality regulations. And NDEQ, the Natural Resources Districts, the Department of Health and Human Services, all share responsibility for our clean water. What we found out is that there are gaps in protection, and AltEn has proven that point. This slide shows that these are all the private wells in this area right around Mead. There are 36,524 private drinking water wells in Nebraska, and 88% of Nebraskan residents rely on groundwater for drinking. NDEE has to get it right. Next slide. In 2014, AltEn took over the plant, as Leesa pointed out. NDEE now says that they knew about the treated seed corn being used in the ethanol production in 2015. I've gone through thousands of records and found that little action was taken specific to the pesticide residue from the seed corn over the 4+ years. Next slide. But truly, NDEE doesn't have the authority to enforce regulations. They have to go to the Attorney General to even levy fines. And only the legislature can change that. This statement is a quote from their notice of violations. The governor and the legislature have to act to change the system that allow this to happen. Next slide. These are the very first testing results of the wet cake at the AltEn. These are the very first testing results of the wet cake at the AltEn facility. This was done in February 2016, but no test was done for the seed corn pesticides. These are the routine tests that are done on wet distiller's grain from regular corn. Of note is that AltEn continued to file permits and updates that indicated the wet distiller's grain was for animal feed. Next slide. Between 2016 and 2018, multiple permits for discharge of wastewater, building the biochar unit, and changes in the composting operation were approved by NDEQ. This just shows one example. NDEE approved the expansion, but by November, they were issuing letters of warning for unauthorized composting. Next slide. After multiple complaints from Mead residents that you've heard, including those from Jody and Paula, an inspection was finally done that resulted in multiple violations of wastewater discharge, improper storage of waste, and emissions from the biochar unit. At that visit, seed corn, wet cake, and wastewater were tested by NDEQ. Next slide. However, again, they didn't test for any of the pesticides found in the seed corn because they're not regulated by the EPA. And I know you can't see this very well, but this is testing for things like T4D, 2,4-D that are actually banned by the EPA. They're not for the pesticides that are in the seed corn. On October 23rd, 2018, the Nebraska Department of Agriculture analyzed the wet distiller's grain, and they finally found that there was elevated concentrations of pesticides. The Department of Ag prohibited the use of the solid amendment in May of 2019, and AltEn finally stopped in August of 2019. Next slide. Meanwhile, on March 13th, 2019, we had major flooding in Saunders County. We all remember that. With all the focus on runoff this year, where was NDEE in the spring of 2019 when this happened? Next slide. After the 2019 flood, this is what was found in the West Lagoon, the Overflow Lagoon, the wet cake, and the seed corn. 12 different pesticides were found at levels that the EPA could not confirm would not be harmful to human health. If you note that next to the bottom one is thiamethoxam, and that's one of the highest levels, and in the West Lagoon it's at 35,400 parts per billion, and that becomes important in the next few more slides. All of this data came directly from the NDEE documents. Next slide. They repeated the testing again in November of 2019. This was from the North Lagoon and the West Lagoon. And this time they found 18 unique pesticides in the lagoons that fall. Again, the next to the last one is the thiamethoxam, which was at 24,000 parts per billion. Next slide. Finally, last year, NDEE tested the groundwater for pesticides. Again, this is hard to read, but the thiamethoxam was found at 22.6 parts per billion from the well in the southeast corner of the facility, which is the downstream side of the facility. To date, the lagoons are still full, the liners are still leaking, and more contamination is likely. Next slide. In 2016, AltEn decided to produce biochar from the wet cake since it was not safe for animal feed or land application. So this biochar testing was done in March of 2021, and it shows that, again, there were 13 different pesticides at unsafe level for land application. So it cannot be used as a soil amendment, and it's also considered waste. So now we have waste water, waste wet cake, and waste biochar. Next slide. So in July of 2020, NDEE tested the emissions from the biochar unit. They said there were very small levels of pesticides. They found 4 pesticides in the stack emissions, but since there are no regulations, we don't know if even small amounts of pesticides in the air over long periods is safe for humans, livestock, and wildlife. Next slide. So that's what UNMC is studying, and I encourage all Mead residents to participate with the UNMC screening and research that they're doing, because we just don't know. Nebraskans expect NDE to provide critical protections to surface and groundwater, air and soil in Nebraska in order to safeguard the health of our communities, and I'll take questions later if you have them. Thank you.
Really appreciate that information, Shanice. I think the next speaker is Dr. Zalesky, who I think was worked at the research farm and then now is at Creighton University. Dr. Zalesky.
Well, I'm John Zalesky. I'm a professor of biology at Creighton. I did actually work at Low Line 1 with the Calmet Research Group back in the early 2000s for about a decade. So I got to know the Mead area and appreciate it and really liked working out here, but this is before we knew all this was going on. I was well aware at the time of the work that hasn't really been mentioned about the remediation from the Superfund site that the ordnance plant became and the groundwater contamination that is still being cleaned, and it apparently will take a couple more decades to get through that process. So, and we're facing a contamination upon a contamination as a starting point. So I didn't come prepared with a pointer, but I might ask for a little assistance at times here. But you can see my title has to do with geographic setting, the contamination spread, what are the pathways? We've already seen some of that from Leesa, and we'll see more from Dr. Wu-Smart with Judy's talk. But I'm going to show you some of that, because that's something I do professionally. I'm an aquatic scientist. I do teach environmental toxicology. I have a good background in it, but it's not my main professional area. But I feel quite comfortable talking to you about that, and especially basic concepts that need to be applied here to understand our situation. And so that's the setup. And if I could have the next slide, please.
So this is a map of Saunders County, at least the eastern section, that comes out of a report on a groundwater atlas for the county that was published in 2015 by UNL. I think it's an excellent document, and I just used the map to show you what you've already been hearing. And you probably, if you live here, know that this is now called the Todd Valley, which is an extinct valley of a previous flow path for the Platte River. And it's estimated at least 20,000 years since the Platte changed path, and that puts it in the current path that is east of a divide line in the present. But underneath this newer soil that was prairie before settlement is alluvial sand and gravel, and you probably know that makes a really excellent water storage environment. So there is a very fine aquifer down the length that runs northwest to southeast of this valley. That also is the path for surface water. And I probably don't need to tell local residents, you know that. A lot of these creeks are not very large. I noticed driving on 92 over Johnson Creek, it's about that wide at this flow. But we also know when you have hard rains that these paths and formal creek channels, as we get further downstream, can get quite enlarged. And I do a lot of remote sensing. I work, in fact, that was my involvement with the Calmic group at UNL. We were all working together to better understand water quality from what we could see from aircraft and satellite imagery. And so we were actually, in our work over at Load Line 1, created constructed wetlands, some big ponds, and we were doing different mixtures under control to understand with regulated with measured concentrations of clays and algae and bottom plants and some other constituents, what signals we were getting that we could relate. And it was actually some of the first really meaningful ways that we got good algorithms to be able to predict, say, chlorophyll in water and how harmful algal blooms. So that kind of work was already in hand. And we got familiar with Johnson Reservoir at the time. Some of our activity was actually over to the east of Load Line 1, right by the reservoir. So at any rate, you might notice too, has been pointed out, this all confluences at Ashland, and through Johnson Creek joining Clear Creek, and Clear Creek then receiving some flow. I'll show that a little better. But it all ends up down at the southeast corner of the county at Ashland and entering Salt Creek, which you know is the drainage from Lincoln. And that's where the municipal well field is too. So next slide, please. I work with various means, and I teach environmental remote sensing. That's being taught this semester. And I use USDA data called Cropscape, and it's a real great quick look at what land use is in any part of North America. It's taken from Landsat data every year in the summer. They bin the data together to get complete coverage. So I don't need to tell most of you what your land cover is like. You see a lot of green and yellow. Green is soybeans, yellow is corn, okay? But you can see it's a pretty refined classification. And I now have all that data for this polygon, or this rectangle, for the last 20 years. So it's easy to see what any trends are by doing that. But if you go to the next slide, this is a pie chart showing the land use. And so not surprisingly, corn and soybeans constitute about 68% of land use. If you add in alfalfa, hay, pasture, you get up into this high 70%, and there is surface water at 4%. Grass and pasture is an important part there. 11% is in grass pasture. Wetlands, there's about 3% in deciduous forest. So there's some natural features that add up to about 6%. But that is in that area. Now it results vary by where I delineate. But for this area that's in the surroundings of AltEn, that's your land use. And that to me is an important baseline as one of the layers we need to know to help you guys with understanding contaminant distributions, et cetera. Next slide. I took a drone out with me. I'm an FAA certified drone pilot now since 2018. I use it a lot in my research. Most of my research, by the way, is coastal, and most of my time is in the summer spent down on the Georgia coast. And I study waterways that go two directions. Water comes in, water goes out with the tides. It's a little different than here, but I'm quite comfortable with stream systems and the physics and ecological considerations. At any rate, I got up above and I did not cross any AltEn property to get these. I got on the other sides of the road. So this is a J and 10 and looking north. And so you can see Black Angus feeding on that field just to the west. You can see the AltEn. You can see some water ponded on the southwestern corner. And at any rate, that's been helping me to understand the lay of the land, and especially this immediate proximity. Next slide. Okay, so one of the things I first did, and I've only been on this project about 3 weeks. Dr. Wu Smart has been alerting the public and scientists to the problems for much longer than that. But I was asked whether I might be able to provide some service, and it's pro bono. Nobody's paying me for this, just so you understand. I have no financial commitment in this at all, but I view it, we are encouraged at Creighton to do service to the community, and I feel very strongly that if I can be of some service to this community, I want to be a part of that with this problem. Now, these are the two flow charts that I initially plotted out, and now I understand there's some more avenues in which water can come off the plant, but these are probably ones that locally you would recognize. And path 1 is joined into Johnson Creek and comes through the reservoir before it flows south and joins with Clear Creek. And then this other one is not named on maps, but we're calling it flow path 2 right now. And I know that I've got it right because a colleague of mine, I think Pierce is here today, just checked, and it lines up with the USGS mapping of that. And this is a really important site that I think Judy's going to talk about too, because it comes right across the NREC property. And we know that it gets out in overflow, especially as it tries to get through past, is it Route 7 or Road 7, that there's some culvert and blockage there. So it can back up on their property as a result of that. So, I've also put in magenta Lincoln's well field, so you can see where this confluence is just above Ashland. And the confluence actually goes into Salt Creek, which is, Lincoln can't drink their water locally because it's salty. There's ancient salt beds that cause that situation. So that's why they pump water from that well field. And those wells go pretty deep, and I don't think the aquifer's under real direct jeopardy yet. But groundwater is much slower than surface water, and that was one of the reasons I think that U.S. taxpayers have spent so much through CERCLA and Superfund to be cleaning up this groundwater, because ultimately, if you let that go, it gets down to the Platte. So that's some of my consideration. I wanted a good foundation of where does water go, and also that it can pond on these high flows and seep in. And now that we're learning how much soil contamination there is, that becomes a really important part of the story, because not only can it flow off, but and these neonicotinoids are relatively water soluble as pesticides go, which means they can chart a path vertically down into the groundwater. It may take some time, it may not, but this can continue to happen into the future, and so that's a consideration. Next slide. Now, the spill in February was really important. I didn't get out there till I think it was late March, but I got up above where the culvert comes out. A major part, but not all of the flow, I think, came down in that southeast corner. And so on that date, that water really stunk, and it had an oily sheen, and it was very dark, and it was clearly contaminant water. And I got over on the other side on 7 of the National Guard property, and I'm walking away from it. Yes, let's try that. So I saw the same situation over at the east side of the National Guard property, and that flows directly into Johnson Creek. There's wildlife along there, beaver activity, waterfowl, and I know as soon as we started putting constructive wetlands in, we had frogs galore coming into low line 1. So there's a lot of amphibian populations here too. And those are going to be studied in the UNMC investigation as part of the environmental background. We want to know, and I'm on that investigative team now. So at any rate, that's just a site from where that spill, a lot of it was coming out in the southeast corner. Next slide. So now I'm going to, and there'll be a quiz after this. Now I'm going to give you in one slide what I teach a semester in toxicology. But these are some considerations if we're going to understand any contaminant situation. So S is solubility. You know, some pesticides are not very soluble, and we can separate that out in some fairly easy testing called an octanol water coefficient, and I'll get to that in a moment. But will it stay in the water, or will it start binding to sediments in the water or to soil particles? And that's a really an important consideration. And of what we consider water quality pollutants in the United States, the biggest amount by weight mass is soil runoff. So it's best if that soil runoff is not carrying contaminants. It can carry heavy metals from mining. It can carry pesticides. So, you know, where's it sticking to, or is it staying soluble? Volatility. Does it stay on the ground, or does it loft into the sky? And that's a vapor pressure thing that is known. And in fact, any pesticide has to be, for registration, there's certain chemical properties, including molecular weight and volatility, that have to be published, okay? But it makes it complicated because not all operate the same. So some might volatilize quite rapidly into the air, others not so much. Hang time is a way of saying, what's the residence? How long does it stay in one spot? And so some of this is water moving, but some of this is surface water moving down slope and vertically in the soil column. But it also can be natural breakdown. So there are microbes in the soil that can start to break certain molecules apart. So there are degradation products, and those aren't necessarily good things. Sometimes the degradation products, what we call the metabolites, are just as toxic, but in different ways sometimes from the active ingredients of your agricultural chemicals. Ability to enter, so overcoming barriers. Can it get past certain things that might be barriers, either externally in the environment or as it reaches organisms? Is it going to get across our epithelial, our skin, or ingested or eaten? And this is true of any animal out there. What are the pathways it might get internal? And if so, if it does reach inside, then what is going to be the effect, which will be very dose dependent in terms of on the health of the organism. And this applies to all organisms. It can be plants, it can be fungi, but a lot of attention, of course, because we are in the association with the animal kingdom that if a vertebrate, and especially if you lump vertebrates versus invertebrates, there's a lot of things we learn. You're not going to do the testing that you need to know about toxicity from human testing, but a lot of this is done with animal tests. And so a lot of the prediction of what are the effects of these conditions come from that. Indirect effects are you can damage components of an ecosystem, the living components, and others aren't affected because they don't have the same sensitivities, but that can still damage the whole food chain. And so at an environmental level, we're interested in how contaminants may affect the whole food chain. And then wild cards. These are the things that are the most hard for us to get right, and that is where there's nonlinearities in dose response curves. And one of the biggest ones is when two or more are mixed together, it's possible to have what's called synergy or potentiation, where the outcome of the toxicity is more than just the additive effects of the two separate compounds. Now we're hearing we've got up to several dozen of these compounds together, and they're not all just insecticides, which are the neonicotinoids, but also fungicides are in the seed dressing. And this is all in a mixture, in a mush that comes out in the solubles at the bottom of the digesters, okay? So that is not a good thing to have that mixture, because it's a lot harder to predict what the health consequences are, and it can vary. Next slide. So that's toxicology in a nutshell, in a way. So I was curious, what's in seed corn dressings? And it is somewhat proprietary in some cases, but mostly if you dig, you can find the labeling, and so there can be, there can be multiple, just on one seed, one company's seed, and those of you that are in farming must know this, and hopefully you read the ingredients and take the safety precautions, because that is important in applying it. And if done right and registered, it works pretty well. But it's good to know, especially with AltEn down there, what has been coming in these massive amounts. And so I won't spend the time reading that list, although that middle one in the insecticides, clothianidin, is widely used now. In fact, I was curious. It's in the tick and flea protection we put on our dogs. You read the label. It's the primary insecticide that you're using. Now, that would suggest it's safe because we don't want to harm our dogs, and neither do the manufacturers. But it's all, in toxicology, it's all dose dependent too. Next slide. Don't get too concerned. I'm not going to say very much about this. But one of the things I want to tell you is that we do not know a whole lot about the environmental toxicology of fungicides, even though in some places, like in vineyards, you use quite a bit. You might get 6 sprayings a year in a vineyard in some parts of the world where molds and diseases are dangerous to those crops. But what I have here are tendencies that we need to understand to say, where is this stuff going to go? So the top left is biomagnification, a test that can tell us, is it going to move up the food chain and concentrate? Those are things that tend to be lipophilic and water phobic as you go up. And these are logarithmic values. So what this says too is in these environmental movements of contaminants, there are many orders of magnitudes of difference in different chemical compounds, okay? So you need to know what's in the compounds, or what the compounds are. The next one is soil binding, the higher up on those. And oh, by the way, the left is fungicides, then herbicides and insecticides. And this was put together by European scientists. So there's binding to soil, moving up the food chain, water solubility, how water soluble is it? And so there's a lot of difference. It depends on what you've got. Water half-life and soil half-life. You don't need to know all those numbers or understand that chart, just to know that there's a lot of consideration that goes into understanding where contaminants are going to go in the environment. I'm just about done there. Next slide. So, what keeps people awake at night, it varies by what we do. But, if you're your first responder, or if you're responsible for city infrastructure or response to natural disasters, toxicologists that may have to respond to a spill. Big storms and floods are a bad thing because in a short period of time you can move a lot of contaminants in many different directions and increase the ponding that can increase the path to groundwater. And we're going to talk about 2019 real quick here. Safety of municipal water supplies. What's one of the first things we worry about in a flood? Safe drinking water, right? Contaminants can be unleashed in mobile in a short period of time. March 2019 was our wake-up call. We were all waking up when that happened, weren't we? Next slide. So I went to some European satellite data that spies on you. It's 10 meters, so we can't see license plates, but we can see what's going on in bigger patterns. And this is 2 days after March 14th, when things started to break loose. And you can see, for instance, I'm pointing to the flow paths, Clear Creek and the Platte Water. Those are mixing right over the vicinity of the Lincoln well field on that date. They are coming together. And all that water has been coming down off of Todd Valley that got to there. So it can happen. Obviously that was an unusual event, and hopefully we don't see that again in our lifetimes. But that was an event that got our attention. But also I was curious, I've drawn an area, the area up above there is where we are here, and what was, and clearly those flow paths in Johnson Creek were really brimming back then. And I think somebody showed a picture of the highway, you're looking down the highway and there's water across the road. So there was a lot of water. And next slide is a close-up, and this is 5 days later. And you can, if you start looking at this, there's still ponded water on fields. There is wetness that suggests a lot of infiltration of maybe what was sheet flow. So it may be explaining some of the patterns you're about to hear from Judy. Next slide. So I don't think I want to tell you much about this other than what makes it hard for us to predict are nonlinear phenomena, dose and response, and thresholds where things might be going along smooth and then you start to see an effect. It just starts to ramp up all of a sudden. Those that can catch you off guard. So those are things that make it hard for us to do what we try to do in modeling and tell you what's going on. Next slide. And this is the last slide, I believe. And I'm only going to say that what this shows is that synergy, this wild card. If you put a fungicide, in this case, together with one of these neonicotinoids, that 3 different bee species are behaving differently, but in each case, there was more damage when 2 compounds were exposed to the bees, one's a fungicide and one an insecticide, than when they were separately dosed. And that's what we don't want to see, but unfortunately they exist. And that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Zales. The last, not the last speaker, but the next speaker is going to be Jody Weible. When Senator Bosselman introduced the bill in January, I testified, and so did Judy. I was so impressed with the things that she had to say in the presentation she made, all of which were facts that I thought made everybody sort of wake up and say, this is a serious problem. So thank you, Judy, for all that work that you've done, and I think you'll be very impressed with what Judy has to tell you.
Thank you. Here, why don't I start with this one? Does that work? Turn this one off. Okay, before I start, I want to thank everybody here for inviting me. Despite the unfortunate circumstance that's brought us all here, I've really enjoyed working, and I want to thank the community leaders and the sponsors who have put this on. It's been a privilege engaging with these really committed citizens. Next slide. I wanted to start by kind of providing a little background about myself. I know a lot of you have kind of known me as the researcher who's lost bees in Mead, but I've actually been studying ecotoxicology in bees for many years. I have been studying bees and specifically various effects of pesticides on bee health since about 2006. And this includes more recent research on neonicotinoids and insecticides and their impacts on egg-laying behavior on honeybee queens and bumblebees. So my appointment at UNL in the Department of Entomology is split between research and extension, and that means I spend half my time studying these bee stressors, and then the applied research that our team conducts then informs our research training programs. So through our extension efforts, we also engage with our stakeholders, landowners, and the general public to make science accessible and to kind of find solutions for emerging issues just like this one. My role today is to kind of provide some context to the bee losses and to kind of explain what systemic pesticide pollution is, how it's relevant here. Then finally, I want to try to explain from my understanding of the insect literature some of the exposure risks, the challenges, and unknowns that we're facing. Next slide. So really quick introductions to the rest of our team. We do have a co-director and several students in our lab, including past and current graduate students. Next slide. We also have several committed and hardworking technicians, including several undergraduate technician students. And these are some of the past and present undergrads that are working in our lab. Many of them are working on their own independent projects through our program. Next slide. As part of their professional development training, these students are providing outreach and extension services and events and engage with the public, including our beekeeping courses, on-site inspections for beekeepers, and assisting with our educational partners like the State Museum, Morrill Hall, and Lincoln Zoo, and Nebraska Shram Education Center. These are all places that we help maintain their observation hives to conduct pollinator conservation education. Next slide. Our graduate students also conduct on-farm research, and so this is including our current collaboration with Kimball Orchard in Nebraska City, as well as the efforts and our partnerships with the Center of Rural Affairs and the Department of Ag to reach underserved communities. Next slide. I bring this up because one of our students, Service Group of Bakel, was our previous PhD student whose research was conducted at the Eastern Nebraska Research Extension Education Center, or NREC. And from the literature, we know that pesticide-laden dust may be blown into habitats or pollinator habitats during corn planting, which can contaminate the nearby flowers where bees may become exposed during foraging. So Dr. Bakel's research was focused on examining the roles of existing tree lines and blocking pesticide drift during the planting to see if exposure risk could be mitigated through strategic placement of these new habitats. So strategically placing them behind drift barriers over here, preventing mitigation and exposure. So this is a nice graphic by our partners from the National Agroforestry Center. Next slide. My predecessor, Dr. Marion Ellis, successfully kept bees throughout his career until his retirement in 2014. And Dr. Ellis is here tonight, so he may be willing to share some historical context. But I started keeping bees at NREC in 2017 and have had zero survivability only at this location since. And in 2019, we shifted our research program to specifically investigate the timing and duration of these losses, but we determined that these losses were inconsistent with any of the farm practices occurring on and at NREC. Next slide. Dr. Vakel's study showed that milkweed leaves had abnormally high levels of cothianidin, a neonicotinoid insecticide, and these pesticide results were initially contested, contested and retested. Next, go ahead and push it again. Several of these were high levels of pesticides were associated with these waterways, which led us to indicate that there might be something going on with the water contamination, particularly as these compounds are highly water soluble. So after our bees started to die again in May of last year, we reached out to NDA and EPA to discuss these concerns and request assistance. Next slide. Unfortunately, officials were not able to assist with these investigations because the bees did not die from the misuse of a pesticide, and pollinator protection regulations are governed under Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA. However, treated seeds are exempt from FIFRA regulations at the federal level. So while we have observed these losses, go ahead and push it again, we still need to identify how these bees are getting exposed, to which compounds, at what levels, and where they're occurring. So after our meeting with the officials, we did deploy 12 additional hives at 5 new locations around NREC. Next slide. Within a week, these new hives began exhibiting acute toxicity and high losses of worker bees. So monitoring traps on hives at other control sites or comparable locations were not affected and show few dead bees. The photos on the left were from hives located at the fire shop and agronomy sites, go ahead and push it again, which are roughly 2 to 3 miles away from the plant. The bee losses and our preliminary data suggest that there's high systemic pesticide pollution occurring and leaching from contaminants into nearby plants. Next slide. Based on the Journal Star's article's estimate, there may have been over 1 million pounds of treated seed processed at this facility thus far. However, the research team will work with officials and stakeholders to get better estimates. So this is important, and I mention this because while the facility has discontinued the practice, there still continues to be a need to dispose of surplus, outdated, and pesticide-treated seeds. So where is it going to go now? Go ahead and click it again. There's going to be national implications to what's happening in Nebraska right now. And we look forward to collaborating collectively with our stakeholders and our community leaders to better understand the compounds in these seed treatments and the potential environmental fates of the byproducts. We also will assist in any manner we can to inform mitigation efforts and contribute to the discussions about alternative solutions for disposal needs. Next slide. The wet cake products exhibit extremely high levels of pesticides, including neonicotinoid insecticides and several fungicides. Roughly 33,000 tons of wet cake was land applied to local farms in 2018 and 2019. And you can see from this NDA pesticide report, some of those levels were as high as 554,000 parts per billion cothianidin. Okay, next slide. Cothianidin, like we mentioned before, is a systemic insecticide, and it can move into all parts and expressed in all parts of a plant. So systemic insecticides are used to control hard-to-reach pest insects that feed on the roots and stems and leaves. Go ahead and click it again. However, the residues may also be expressed in the nectar and the pollen where bees are becoming exposed. So we rely on residue studies on plants that bees forage on to determine the potential environmental exposure level, how much of the residue is being taken up by the plant and what the bees are exposed to. Previous studies on imidacloprid, which is a very similar neonicotinoid, has shown relatively low residue levels when it's been planted in seed crops, but higher levels when these plants are soil applied or treated through water. And so I think it's important to point out that when we're trying to accurately assess exposure level or environmental exposure, this is really difficult because it depends on the plant, it depends on the application, how it got there, is it in the soil, is it in the water, how much of it is there, and the soil type. Next slide. From the National Agricultural Statistics Service model, there's been an exponential growth in the usage of neonicotinoids products over the years. And in 2011, there was roughly 4.7 million pounds of the 3 main compounds used in the US. Next slide. However, if you were to visit the usage map today, this would be significantly reduced, click it again, because in 2015, they stopped documenting the use of seed treatments due to the complexity and uncertainty of these estimates. So unfortunately, there's really no good way to estimate how much treated seed is produced and how much we have that is in surplus. Next slide. The persistence and bioactivity of neonicotinoids is highly varied and dependent on the soil type, like we mentioned before. Persistence can range from a few months to over a year and is more persistent in soil with higher organic matter. However, even though it's in the soil, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bioactive. So that means there's very little that we actually understand about how much in the soil is uptaken by the plants and then activated or expressed in those plants. Okay, so there's a lot. Keep going, next slide. There are 7 active ingredients within the class of neonicotinoid insecticides, and not all are equal in toxicity. So the ones that we mentioned, cothianidin, thiamethoxam, and imidacloprid, are the ones that are most toxic. They roughly 40 to 50 parts per billion can kill 50% of a test population in the laboratory testing. However, in those trials, we're conducting those tests on individual worker bees, so a colony of bees can tolerate much higher levels, around 100 to 200, before showing adverse effects. Next slide. From previous studies, we know that pesticides do not have to outright kill a bee to harm the colony. In this video, I fed small colonies, about 3,000 to 5,000 bees, a small amount of neonicotinoid in syrup. And you can see the difference. In this colony is an active colony that's being fed 0 neonicotinoids, just syrup. In the second colony, you'll see that they are alive, but they are rendered completely inactive and unproductive. The colony is unable to forage, lay eggs, care for brood, and will not be strong enough to survive winter. The concern is if Dr. Vickel detected concentrations of milkweed leaves as high as 5,000 parts per billion, what's in the nectar and the pollen of these plants? Next slide. I saw signs of the bees that were dying from contaminated forage. So in this first video, their proboscis, or their tongues, are stretched into food cells, and this bee is apparently dying mid-feeding or food processing. Can you click the next video? Oh. Maybe they're waiting on the videos? There you go. Go ahead and click the second video too. You might have to manually click. In the second video, you can see an impaired monarch butterfly unable to fly. Now, we don't know whether this butterfly is sick or maybe just perhaps old, but if you can click the third video, oops, what happened to that one? Yeah, in the third video, there's a painted lady on the right, yeah. That's all right, you can skip it to the next one. It's often placed in the next one as well. You'll see this butterfly basically sits there on a plant and has trouble extending its tongue and kind of feeding. Ah, there he goes. There he goes. Okay, they're showing it right now. So you can see that in that third video, it does show an impaired butterfly directly feeding on a milkweed just in the field. Okay, next slide. So it's quite obvious that the butterfly, again, there's about 2 minutes of this just kind of impaired, and as a result, you can see in the field, this butterfly is vulnerable to basically everything. It can't avoid heat, it can't avoid desiccation, cold, and predation. I don't even need a net to collect these insects. They are so impaired cognitively, locomotively. I'm pulling them off the plant, which is very abnormal. So I do suspect, on the image on the left, you see that these bees are likely water foragers collecting plant mutation or fluids that are excreted from the plant. This bee is dead collecting water, and that water is critical for thermal regulation in the hive. So these, again, are signs that further indicate that there's potentially high levels of contaminants being taken up by the plants. And this is something that isn't talked a lot enough in this discussion. So I wanted to bring this up. Next slide. I suspect that the bees are dying from what I'm calling systemic pesticide pollution. And what this means is systemic pesticides like neonicotinoids and several kinds of fungicides can move from the water and from soil into plants. So systemic pesticides can be expressed in the leaves, the nectar, and the pollen, where then wildlife become exposed. Now, while pesticides and other chemicals are highly regulated in standards set for air pollution, water pollution, waste pollution, there's even standards for noise pollution. But there's currently no regulatory division at EPA to address this kind of systemic pesticide pollution expressed in plants. But there are internal discussions happening now because of this circumstance. And while we have known that pesticides, like systemic pesticides, can move into plants that they're not supposed to, this is, like in roadside wildflowers and pollinator habitats, this is a circumstance that really, I think, is at a scale that couldn't be imagined. Next slide. The bees are biological indicators that play a critical role in food support. The photo on the left shows evidence of mammals feeding on the dead bees, while the video shows a bird coming to prey on sick bees. So there might be other animals in this area that are impacted directly or indirectly. Next slide. Keep in mind, though, that this is an agricultural production area. Dr. Shaw has also mentioned the Superfund history of it. So there's already chemical input and regular applications of pesticides as part of typical farming practices occurring. Therefore, our environmental monitoring and pesticide screening must separate the farm practice use and levels that are normally happening from the other contaminants, which happen to be the same chemicals, just at much higher levels. Another challenge for researchers is that neonicotinoid toxicity and risk varies widely across animals. So for example, aquatic organisms and insects are highly sensitive with acute toxicity at 40 parts per billion in bees, but in toxicity in birds and mammals, it's much lower. In birds, you start to see harmful levels at 100,000 parts per billion. So that's quite a difference in concentration. We also know that chronic exposure could lower the concentrations at which harm can occur, and the mixtures of compounds would also likely elicit harmful effects at lower concentrations, like Dr. Shaw has just mentioned. Next slide. Oh, and so before we can understand the impacts, this is just a reminder of this. We have a lot of work to do still to just determine what chemicals, where, and at what levels, and when they're present before we can make any kind of conclusions about impacts. Next slide. Okay, so this diagram is extremely busy and but really informative, and I want to walk through this figure because I think it's critical for this discussion tonight. It was developed by a European working group that reviewed a large collection of literature assessing impacts on neonics across a broad range of animal systems, like it's shown in that first row. The second row shows how each of these animal systems can vary in the routes that they're exposed to neonicotinoids. So for example, there we go. My bees are exposed here mostly to plants and air. So that's depicted in the gray and the green right here. And go ahead and click it again. There's a couple of animations going on here. So that exposure, that row right there talks about exposure or how these compounds will come into contact with the animal. Aquatic critters and amphibians are most at risk through contaminated water, which you can see in blue. The number of color bars depict the level of risk. So the more bars, the greater the risk. So based on the environmental monitoring and pesticide testing, go ahead and click it again, we're going to be able to determine where the highest exposure risk lies. Click it again, please. And that's going to help us inform who's at highest risk and how. So next slide, please. The third row is go ahead and just keep clicking it, yeah. The third row is going to illustrate these ecotoxicological effects on the individual, the population, and the community level. And some animals, such as these insects and aquatic invertebrates, are more sensitive, meaning that harmful effects are going to occur at low doses or after acute exposures. And it's depicted with the 4 little rings or circles right there. Less sensitive animals, such as birds and mammals, are going to be shown with these 2 little circles, meaning that the effects may occur at high doses or after prolonged exposures. Next slide, please. No. Yeah. And then, so what I wanted to note here was that even though these animals seem to be less sensitive, you also have to note that there's more knowledge gaps, particularly at the population and community levels. We just don't know enough to make any really significant conclusions about what's happening at those levels. Next slide. It is it's an unfortunate circumstance, but we certainly have an opportunity to look at things that have really not been studied well. Therefore, keep going, click it one more time. Go ahead and click it one more time. There you go. So my bees and other bioindicator species show rapid acute losses that other animal systems might not show. You might not see a bunch of birds dead in the field like you do the bees, but these highly sensitive critters provide critical ecological services like pollination, pest control, nutrient recycling, and also, more importantly, food web support. And so the loss of these services and food support may be having an impact, go ahead, on a suite of other animals. Can you click it again? Go ahead. And that, what I wanted to point out here is that these biological indicator species are responding quickly, but the impact at the food level and the food chain might require long-term monitoring on the population in these community levels at these less sensitive organisms, but they're certainly susceptible to loss of food. Okay, next slide. I just have a couple more. The EPA has also commented that because of the wet cake and wastewater contaminants have no uniformity or limit in the number and amount of pesticides present, the EPA can't conclude that a land application of the wet cake or discharging of the wastewater will not result in unreasonable adverse effects on humans or the environment. Next slide. This is why we've responded so heavily, and don't hold us to this because this is a draft plan still in working progress. But I do feel a little bit of comfort seeing the think tank that is kind of developing behind the scenes. And so I wanted to kind of bring this out to you to show the incredible, passionate researchers we have committed to learning about this concern. We have numerous researchers from our partners at UNMC, the College of Public Health, and Three Rivers Public Health, Saunders Medical Center, several colleges and departments from UNL and Creighton University. And I also wanted to highlight the work by our California USGS partners, Dr. Michelle Haddock, who's been doing much of our preliminary pesticide testing, and she's going to continue that work in collaboration with Dr. Snow at the Nebraska Water Science Lab on the pesticide screening. We've got other USGS researchers who will also be helping us with plant pollen identification so we can locate where these hot spots are in the landscape. Dr. Liz Van Wormer, who's the director of One Health at UNL, is also leading an effort to recruit more students, faculty mentors, and external partnerships to begin these short and long-term ecological monitoring efforts across the broad way of animals that I just mentioned. Next slide, and this is the last one. So I just want to let you know that if you want to stay informed, take part, this is a website where we're going to be posting a lot of updates and progress. Just be patient with us because there's still a lot of information and details. And as we learn more, that's going to inform more research as we go. So this will be evolving. But we really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you guys today. And thank you.
Last but certainly not least is David Domina, a well-known attorney from the Omaha area. Dave said he needed 35 seconds, but we're going to give him a few more than that.
I said 37. I don't need many more. I don't have much to contribute, but a couple of observations. The Attorney General's lawsuit, 116 well-drafted pages with an articulate description of hundreds of violations of the laws, seek some specific remedies. And the remedies sought are all the remedies the Attorney General can seek. because the Attorney General is handcuffed by the law he was given. The remedies sought are $10,000 a day, multiply that times 365, and you don't touch this problem. Multiply it by 3,650, you might touch this problem. That's a decade worth at $10,000 a day. He also seeks an injunction that would require that the deleterious material be removed, but he can't suggest where it would go or what constraints there would be about where it would go or what it would do when it arrives. He seeks an order that requires that the roads be paved in order to move the material so the air isn't further contaminated, and that's about all you can do with the air. And he seeks an order that says thou shalt not pump the lagoons, and you'll try to repair them so they don't leach any more into the soil. And that is all the power we've given to our Attorney General to enforce the law that is woefully inadequate for this problem. There are only a few solutions to that kind of thing, and they all involve changing the law. Changing the law only happens positively if people insist that it change and don't default that work to huge businesses and corporations. And I'm going to not elaborate on that too much except to make two observations. The first one is, you all remember that the president who gave us the Department of Agriculture was Abraham Lincoln. In his argument to the Congress of the United States to create the Department of Agriculture, he observed that in his view as a child of the prairie, if our bees were all killed, the human population would be extinct in 4 years. The second thing I would observe is about Dr. Woosmart's list of the dedicated researchers who are involved in a solution to this problem. And the observation I would make about that is not one of those researchers on that list is from Monsanto or DuPont or Pioneer or any other industry. So one of the things that needs to be done in the United States is to take our research back from industry and put it in the hands of the people of the United States. Here endeth the sermon for the day.
So now I'm going to ask my panelists to come up and gather up here close to the microphone so that you can ask the questions that you have. And I'm sure one of our panelists will be happy to try to provide answers for that. So don't be bashful. Come back up here and we'll put the mic back here. Remind you again to come to the mic when you're going to speak.
Kyle, you want to go ahead and press the button? So
I did, yeah.
Now, hopefully I'm loud enough that everybody will be able to hear.
Well, we need to have you heard on Facebook Live.
Hello. Is it working?
Give him a second.
go ahead.
Yep, okay. Has anyone been researching what this is doing to our animals, to our families, our neighbors? I've heard a lot tonight about the bees and the environment, and that, you know what, that's important. But I think everybody in this room is important. And I know a lot of people in this area that are having health issues, and we're hearing nothing about it. So, I don't know who's going to be in charge of anything health related to humans, but we need to do something for our neighbors and our families.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, absolutely.
I'm Ann Hubbard from Omaha. I'm a retired physician, and I'm the one that kind of got the College of Public Health to get charged into here. Yes, the College of Public Health is working on this. We have to get things set, they have to get set up. I'm just their booster. So we need to get things set up on how much money they have, who's going to be doing what research. They are going to be looking at human health. The people, they listed Liz Van Wormer. from UNL. She will be looking at animal health. But they have to get organized first. They will be looking at people's, this is all volunteer. No one will be forced to participate in anything. No one wants to make you feel like a lab rat. This is really looking at the health of a community with an unprecedented exposure to pesticides and fungicides. So anyway, they'll be looking at your past medical charts if you allow them to. They will be doing blood and urine samples and also doing an intake on what you say your symptoms are like. Ideally, this will be at least a 10-year study with looking at you every 2 years and see if there's patterns of diseases that come out. I'm hoping for looking to, are there developmental issues within children? Some of the pesticides have been shown to cause developmental delays, learning disabilities in children. Those things show up anytime from birth to age 5. So are there things that can be looked at in our school children here? But yes, there are plans to look at companion animals, so dogs, cats, but also looking at production animals. And for sure, if it was me, I would never eat a cow that's from the Mead cow yard. In addition to, I know nobody here is from the water group, but they will also be looking at testing private wells in addition to looking at surface water. So it will be a comprehensive study. It does take us raising money to do this, and so we're in the process of doing that. But the team is really trying to get organized better now before they come out and talk to you.
So don't be shy. We're here to answer questions.
Is there a method to get rid of this excess seed corn, like what's being used here in this plant?
Anybody want to try to answer that question? I don't know the answer to that question. You've got the wet cake sitting on the ground, and then you've essentially maybe got some seed corn still stored within those structures. I don't know the answer to that. But as far as I know, there's been no plan. Does anyone know anything different? I'm looking to the local folks.
The only approved method of disposal is landfilling that I'm aware of. There's supposed to be that's actually on the tag that the seed bag has on it, is to bury it in a landfill.
So I'm going to repeat that just because the people on Facebook Live might not have heard that. So Paula said according on the seed bags, the only way to dispose of it is to do it through a landfill situation. Or burn it. At a high temperature. Some of us have talked to a firm about that. Obviously, it's nothing that we're going to be able to do, but the firm has talked about a way to do that. I think they've talked to AltEn about that. It's not inexpensive. It's about $300 a ton is what we think, between $200 and $300 a ton. So we're talking a lot of dollars. And that would be to dispose of the wet cake. I think they can treat the water also, but then of course there's an additional cost to that. So we're looking at a lot of money. And the question is, where's the money going to come from and what's going to happen to the plant in the meantime? Next question.
What is the depth of the contaminated water at this time? Does anyone know?
Janice, do you want to come up and answer that?
The testing that they did on the groundwater at the site was at 28 feet below the surface of the well. So it's 28 feet.
Is there testing being done currently for the water and surrounding areas? How far is it? And is there any recommendations for people right now, you know, until more research is done? What should we be doing regarding the water? Should we be drinking it?
Especially for drinking water, there are some really reliable filters now that can be put in line. We have one in our home that uses a charcoal block, but it's very well designed, and it'll last about a year, and it should remove virtually all of the organics that you're concerned about. So I think a device like that would be practical in this situation. It's not terribly expensive, and there's an annual fee to replace that filtration block. And probably the more contaminated there is, the more often you might need to change it out. But you know, those are available if you go online and then look up. You probably, you know, how do you gauge which one's a better product? We use Consumer Reports to decide what one we would put on our house. But we do think that it's effective.
So you would recommend that?
Well, I don't want to represent a given product, but I think that is a prudent measure when you just don't know in a given well what might be coming out right now. And this thing is, you know, the longer this goes, the more it can spread. So you might be okay now, in 5 years you might not be. And if you get into groundwater cleanup like they're doing for the Superfund site already, this is a very long-term process, and you can't wait that long. You know, you got to be watching for your health right now. You know, and I'll just interject that ideally that we wouldn't wait a long time to see this cleanup, because the longer that sits on the ground and is in these lagoons that are leaking, the worse it's going to get. So the quicker this can get remedied, it's the best for your community. I'm quite confident of that.
The private wells that have been tested so far, the folks requested from NDEE to get that testing done. So if you have concerns about your well, you can contact NDEE and request for them to come out and do the testing. If you have to do it yourself, it's very expensive, but in this case, NDEE should be doing the testing. And I think the university program will be doing testing eventually, but in the meantime, I think what Jody said is that she requested from the NDEE to get her well tested, and they did finally do it. So.
And should we test it regularly? I mean, how often should you have it NDEE tested? Do you have any? Is there any guidance?
I think with the university study, we'll find out. If it's in the water and if it's moving, then we'll have a better idea, perhaps. We just don't have answers.
Yeah, okay.
You know, I think, as I understand it at least, because of the ordinance plant that was here, there is testing that's been done through an ongoing process. You know, the one thing though that's different is they're testing for different things. And in most places where you're testing a well, you're testing for nitrates or something. We've never been in a situation where we're testing for these things. So this is a whole new thing that we need to move on and develop a plan for, correct?
Some guidance for locals would be, you know, immediate guidance would be helpful.
So we're hoping that people who are listening tonight can give that guidance and give us some leadership on where we go. I mean, I agree with you. I certainly sympathize with the situation you're in.
Hey everyone, my name is Jane Clabb. I'm with Bold, Nebraska. So I'm asking questions on Facebook. I'll interweave those with folks that are live. So one of the questions is from Facebook, and I'll actually add a comment to it because I'm concerned and confused. What is the next step? What's going on with the legislature? What's going on with Governor Ricketts? I mean, how many folks in the room know somebody who's sick? I mean, clearly there's a problem. And if the bees are dying, that clearly means that health impacts are happening. So I'm happy that Ricketts and the Attorney General filed a lawsuit, but now what? Like, people are obviously sick, so our government should be doing something. We don't need a 10-year study to tell us that people are sick. People are sick.
You're 100% correct. When Senator Kavanaugh introduced the bill, which there were two bills introduced in the body. One was to stop production of ethanol from treated seeds, and the other was a liability bill to assign liability to the seed manufacturers. So that bill came quite late in the hearing process. I testified on behalf of that, so did Ken Winston for Interfaith Power and Light. Both of us suggested that it was time that the legislature put together a legislative task force, which is somewhat different than an interim study, which would enable them to sort of take control of this and manage it to a point, because, from my perspective as a former state senator, it's urgent, and we also have a need for resources, and I'm talking dollars, obviously, because you can't do these studies with a few, without money. So, my objective, my hope is that the legislature will make the decision that, yes, we do need to have a study done, and it needs to be immediate so that there's an answer for the people in the Mead area so that we can mitigate the problem and resolve the problem if it's at all possible to do so. In the meantime, you still have all the piles of wet cake sitting on the ground here. You still have the treated seed corn in the bins apparently. So, that's a solution that needs to be remedied quickly. Other questions?
As a resident of Mead, I've lived here my whole life. Couple things. If people that aren't around here are real close, the piles you see there's an irrigation well that's probably less than 15 yards from these piles. And my second thing is, this meeting has been informative. I've learned a lot, but we want real answers. And when I called down to the governor's office, the DEE, I don't even know who all I called. And all you get a runaround, and the residents of Mead want answers, not information, answers.
And I think we all want answers. I completely agree with you. Your senator is the head of the Natural Resources Committee. I think he's concerned about it, but if I were all of you, I'd keep in touch with that office on a daily basis and say we need answers and we need them quickly, and we need the legislature to take action.
We tried to have a meeting with the DEE and they wouldn't show up. So what does that make us residents feel like? Totally forgotten and left out.
That's one of the reasons we're having this meeting tonight.
So far, the local NRD has not stepped up to do anything to help us, and that's their job.
So
I want to make a comment about that, if I may, for a second. So here's what I want to say about that.
Dave, can I wait and get you the mic?
Sure. This is a really practical answer to that problem. You have to stay with it and stay with it and stay with it and stay with it and stay with it. One of my dearest friends spent 20 years of his life fighting over something that none of us would disagree about for 20 minutes. But it took at least that long in his life to get it solved. And that was stopping the sale of 4 million cans of beer to an impoverished population in a podunk little spot called White Clay in Nebraska. You're not going to get all of the answers you want because there isn't enough information to supply them. There are some simple takeaways here for some obvious reasons, like an irrigation well 15 feet away from the piles. Number one, don't wait for somebody to test your well, even if it's expensive, get it tested. Number two, don't wait for somebody from government to tell you to put a filter on your well. Put on a filter. So let's assume you find out in 10 years you didn't need it. Pretty good bet, because it's a better bet you're going to find out in 10 years you wish you would have had it. So you have to be proactive about those things. As for getting DEE out here, you know, essentially it's activated by some lawyers with some support people who are not scientists of the caliber of the scientists you've heard from tonight. It's just the way it is. So support these people and encourage that kind of research. Don't accept somebody else's answer. If you're curious, be proactive and protect yourselves. That's the best thing you can do now. The second best thing you can do now is remember the lesson about when the best day is to plant a tree. 20 years ago, and if you miss that date, today. And that means not for this mead, but for the next mead, and for the next mead, and for the next mead. What is the next substance that we're not regulating, that we're not paying attention to, that somebody's processing? The lesson that comes out of this should be help everything we can do to solve this problem and prevent the next ones. Stay on it. Stay on it.
Other questions?
So who should we write? You know, if we're all sitting here tonight, we all wrote some letter, and who should we be writing to?
So Dr. Herbert asks the question, if we all wrote letters or made phone calls, who should we write to? And I'd say all of the above. You know, I'd start with people in Washington. I'd write to President Biden and say, we've got a crisis here in Mead, Nebraska, and we need help. I'd write to Fortenberry or Smith, whoever your representative is here. Smith is mine, and he seems to have almost all the state. But and your senators. I would write to the governor. I would write to your legislator, and in all the legislators. You know, there are only 49 of them, and you can CC every one of them. And a lot of people care. You know, this is Nebraska, where even people in the far west of the state care a lot about the people here. So those folks will take action if they know how urgent the issue is. And I'd write to your local newspapers. Keep it in the news so that people are aware of what's going on and that nothing has been done here and that there are crises coming.
Report every cancer. Report every respiratory disease. Let somebody else look for the reason. Report them as they happen, one by one, to those people until they're sick of getting those letters.
Well, that was going to be my question. I've come down with a pretty serious GI problem, and I'm seeing a GI specialist.
Can everybody hear?
Sorry, guys. I've come down with a really bad GI problem, and I'm seeing a specialist, and that's just developed within the past 8 months. What should I be asking him? Because it is something that I could have ate. It could have been something in the air. It could have been something I drank. What do I specifically ask him? Is there some chemical that I should be making him aware of that could have produced what I've got going on? Because this is something I'm going to have to live with my whole life now. What do I ask him to look for?
I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to have Judy come up. I say the first thing you do is you tell your physician that you come from Mead, where we have this contamination situation with neonicotinoids and fungicides, and go from there. And then I have a question for Dr. Wismar after she gives you the answer.
So unfortunately, I'm not a human health expert, but I certainly would encourage you to reach out to our UNMC partners. We have Jesse Bell and a number of folks who are specifically there to be your point person for those questions. We have Saunders Medical Center as well as Three Rivers Health Department as well. So all of these folks can be people that you connect with if you have questions. Even have your physician connect with our research team. That might be a useful conversation for them to have as well.
So, Dr. Wismar, the question I have, the way we consume food has a lot to do with the bacteria that are in our gut. So, do we have any idea how exposure to these neonicotinoids affect bacteria?
I know that we talked a lot about neonicotinoid insecticides tonight, but that is a great question because there were a lot of fungicides that were found in this mixture. And these contaminants, these fungicides, there's a very, there's little known about the impacts of fungicides compared to herbicides and insecticides on humans and mammals. But there's growing literature showing that there's these trends that fungicides can alter the gut microbiome, the gut microbes, not just in bees, but in humans as well. And that imbalance could shift some issues. I'm not a health expert, but that is something that you might be considering as an issue. Is these fungicides do have the ability to change the microbe in your gut. Thank you.
I came in a couple minutes late, so I don't know if this was answered. Where is AltEn?
Where's the plant?
Where are their representatives?
Okay, we didn't ask them to come.
Okay.
We didn't anticipate they would come.
Okay. And then my other question is, where this has been spread all over the fields of all of Saunders County, but also in some of the articles I read that it was disposed of in the Butler County landfill. Is there anything being done, because all of that water heads this way? So what is being done to bring even people in Butler County maybe aware of what's going on? I know my sister has friends that are amateur beekeepers and they've lost their colonies. So is anything being done as far west as getting into Butler County and the whole of Saunders County, understanding this impacts them, not just this town?
Well, I think that's a great point. As to the landfill, we've heard rumors that there were truckloads of contaminated soil, or whatever you want to call it, taken there. I've never seen actual proof that took place.
I talked to them, and they were getting maybe four semi-loads a day.
Okay, did y'all hear that? Jody said that she has spoken to the Butler County landfill, and they have received 4 truckloads a day. But if you think about, we've heard 84,000 tons out here, so 4 truckloads a day doesn't make a dent in anything. Other questions?
Randy Rupert, Nebraska Communities United. I don't have a question, but as I drive by there several times now, if I want to build a garage, I have to get a sweat plan. I have to put fencing around my property for runoff. As of 6:30 tonight, there was still no fencing around any of that pollution. Who's missing here tonight? NEE. Who is allowing an out-of-state company to function even after we have filed a 115-page lawsuit? Our legislation, our NEE, our governor. You want to stop Meads from the future? We have to change who we have in our legislature. We have to let corporations know that we have a right, as part of the species of this entire ecosystem, that the entire ecosystem has a right to live without being killed. Thank you.
Next question.
Hello, I'm Cody Morris. I recently moved to Mead 2 years ago, and upon doing so, me and my 2 kids and my wife have had numerous sinus infections when we didn't have them before. And we've also noticed a lot of neighbors, people seemingly just pop up with cancer, and it's pretty rare and pretty odd. I do have a few questions. I know they're not directed directly at you guys, but it's for the community. Excuse me. This one would, maybe you guys know. Was AltEn aware of the hazards of treated grains in 2015?
Was AltEn aware of the
hazards
of
treated grain in 2015?
I would certainly think that they were.
It's on the seed bag.
So it's on the seed bag label, and the business model is to deal with those treated seeds.
Okay.
If they did not, then they were incumbent.
Okay. And is this willful, negligent disregard for human life and the environment?
Yes.
I would say so.
Thank you. Next. Is there government corruption protecting AltEn?
Yes.
Bingo.
I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to give the government the benefit of the doubt in terms of there's some in place. There looks like there was some dismissal of complaints that were made by people that live here in Mead for a number of years. And if there were inspections done and you drove up to this facility and you saw piles of fetid wet cake sitting around, I think you'd have questions.
Is it criminal to kill humans?
It is. Depends on how you do it.
And my final question, when do we, the people, stop this?
So I think your last question is a really good one. And, you know, I started out tonight by saying that Jody has really been one of the leaders in getting this story told. And you as the citizens of Mead and Saunders County, this is not just a Mead issue, it's a Nebraska issue. It's a Saunders County issue, certainly, but you work together with Jody and you develop a team and you start out and you go forward. And I'm going to use Bold, Nebraska as an example in the work that they did with the Keystone XL pipeline. It was a tremendous effort of organizing, community organizing and working together to object to and fight KXL. No matter how you feel about KXL, it was successful, and that's the way you get it done, and that's the way you're going to get it cleaned up here. The squeaky wheel always gets the grease, always. But it has to be steady, constant pressure on your elected officials and the folks at DEE to do the right thing, and encourage the legislature to change the rules if we have to expedite things. Next question.
Well, I didn't hear any questions about the cattle that are there. And they're still feeding cattle, is my understanding. And so I don't know if there's anything been done about the risk of contamination for the cattle. Like one person said she wouldn't eat any cattle that are from there, and I don't know how you'd ever tell where the cattle come from that you're eating. So it's another.
Well, I think the cattle is a very good question. It's one of the, I'm a rancher by nature, so it was one of the first questions I asked after I learned about air contamination, and nobody seems to have an answer. That feedlot's been there as long as AltEn has been there, so there have been cattle that have gone through there before. Who knows what happened to that meat, whether there are long-term ramifications from human consumption of neonicotinoids. I don't have the answer to that. I would be concerned.
But it doesn't seem like, I mean, they're going to continue feeding cattle there.
It looks that way, yes.
Well, those complaints should probably go to the Grain Inspection, Packers and Stockyards Administration of the United States.
Okay.
And they have a regional office in Des Moines. The Packard used to be called just the Packers and Stockyards Administration.
Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, the Saunders County Courthouse, the Board of Supervisors are going to look at a conditional use permit for the people that are trying to buy Mead Cattle Company. I went to the Planning Commission meeting and asked them to table this conditional use permit until the cattle were tested, the manure pits were tested, and the water was tested. And the the Planning Commission voted unanimously to give them a conditional use permit. The next thing is the conditional use permit that the county gave to Mead Cattle Company expired in 2017. So there isn't a permit to transfer. So they issued a new permit, even after I got up and talked. So tomorrow, the Board of Supervisors is going to talk about this, and we need people to show up. we need more than just me there, and say, no, it's got to be tabled till we know that that meat is safe, or they get to have the first steak.
And the permit
What-
that they're issuing, one of the conditions with the permit,
One of the conditions with the permit that they're talking about issuing tomorrow, it will never expire. It's in perpetuity.
What time is the meeting?
That starts at 9. One of the things, just give me 1 second. In any feedlot situation done right, there are feed records and there are animal health records. It's my fondest hope that UNMC's team will look at all of that documentation from the feedlot. Somewhere there's a veterinarian in the area who's treating cattle there. And I think that the UNMC team, it's imperative that they know what are the recurring illnesses in cattle that they're treating for. Are they respiratory? What's their mortality rate? And oh, by the way, how are they handling their mortality? Are they composting the dead cattle? Where's that going? So you have this interconnection. Al asked me to talk about the interconnection of the companies that I described to you earlier. Right now, AltEn, you know, is delinquent on taxes, property taxes and real estate taxes. What happens if on a Friday afternoon they pink slip after they've sold this feedlot? They pink slip all the employees and by 6 o'clock they're in bankruptcy court. What happens to Mead and Nebraska then? Those are all things that you need to talk about, and you need to organize yourselves and become the catalyst for the rest of us. We're behind you, but it starts with you. We're here tonight. Nobody's paying us to be here. We're volunteers. We're with you, but it's got to come from you.
It would appear that our environmental laws in Nebraska are somewhat immature, which seems ironic considering where we make most of our money in the state. But I've spoken with employees at AltEn, and they've expressed concern that it appears, or they're worried that people will think they're complicit. I believe more would come forward and speak about improprieties and things that they've seen if they felt more of the attention was falling on the administration. I mean, Mr. Shaw's name's not been mentioned many times tonight. Mr. Tingelhoff's name, I'm relatively certain I haven't heard tonight. We're not going to get buy-in from people who really have some of the inside information unless pressure's put to bear in the right places. Is there anything that would be criminal or potentially criminal about what they've done? One question. And then the other is, from a legal perspective, as citizens, either the community or individuals, is there any legal pressure we can put on them that would, influence where this goes?
I'm going to defer to Mr. Domino about the legal question.
There are still some really strong federal environmental crimes that can be punished, that can be prosecuted here. We have right now an acting United States Attorney in the District of Nebraska. We'll get a new United States Attorney pretty soon. He will be appointed by a president who has a different attitude about the environment. And I would guess that that will mean there's an audience that is receptive to the idea of prosecuting criminal activity that occurs in an order of magnitude sufficient to attract journalists on another continent before it attracts journalists at home. So I'd encourage you to think about that solution as it comes about and stay closely keyed in. The federal remedies, criminal remedies for environmental infractions are markedly superior to those in the state. There isn't a federal homicide penalty for environmental crimes, but there are coincidental prosecutions. In Missouri, Tyson was prosecuted for 20 environmental felonies at one time. It happened because an employee was killed by an environmentally related accident, and the state of Missouri prosecuted the company for killing him too. So it can happen. In this case, those things you don't want to make those sound like saber-rattling sorts of threats, but they are important to produce information, and the people who made the decisions, not the people who implemented them, are the real people at fault here. The hero will probably be somebody who was an implementer, who has the most to risk in terms of magnitude, not dollars, not total dollars, but it was the woman who brought her only penny who gave the most, wasn't it? It'll probably be somebody like that, and when you find that person, you treasure them.
Before I sit down, I'd just like to thank everyone working on this. I think that the study will have really widespread ramifications, and I think this will, I mean, it's not a love canal situation, I hope, but I do think that this is going to put a stamp on, you know, this area, and I'd like to thank everyone involved.
I'm going to say one other thing. I'm just going to talk about some photographs that I have seen. And I'll turn this over to Judy, but early on when we were seeing the seeds inside the big buildings, there was a picture of a woman in there. She had on PPE, but she had clogs on her feet. And that made me wonder, you know, what is the risk to those employees in terms of their exposure to this seed thing. So I think that's something that someone who has connections with the staff out there that still works there should talk to them about and ask them about how many times did something like that happen where you're not fully attired in the PPE that you should have, because there are risks to inhaling the dust, I would think, and the employees are the ones that are going to be the ones that get sick. So, you know, someone who has connections with them should talk to them about that and sort of work that along, because OSHA is still around and it still has power. You know, the other thing that can be done, and I think maybe will come soon, is just to ask the federal EPA to come in and take care of it.
Why hasn't that been done yet? Why is the EPA not involved?
The question is, why is the EPA not involved? They did come in when the spill took place. I think they were here just a short time. But as I understand it, they usually are asked in by the administration in Nebraska or in whatever state when that's going to take place. And maybe that ask has never taken place.
I was told by Shannon Bartelt-Hunt, who's with the Civil Engineering Department at UNL, that they do have to be asked in. Until they're asked, they will not come. That has been my frustration too. It's like, why aren't all these people here? And it's because there's this whole chain of command that you have to go through, essentially.
So, you know, so there you go. There's the call you make to the governor's office, or the attorney general's office. We want the EPA to come in and investigate this. Everybody in the room should make that call. Judy?
I was just going to make two comments. One, you know, this is really important listening sessions for us and researchers as well. I'm getting feedback from our research partners right now. And Dr. Liz Van Wormer did mention that she is talking with the veterinary toxicologists in the area to look at sampling for that specific question about meat cattle. And the other question I wanted to address was the federal assistance. We have called for a lot of folks to come in and help, and even the federal Fish and Wildlife can't assist without a request. So we were told that, you know, if we do find a lot of birds in the area and we can send it to them, if they get enough of these kind of strange and peculiar losses of life in wildlife, then they could potentially open up a side case investigation, but until asked, they can't come in and just kind of take over. So we have asked. That's definitely been done.
I moved to Omaha about 1.5 years ago and became aware of the problem based on the article in The Guardian where I developed an interest in following this. I don't have a bone in this fight. I mean, I'm 40 minutes from here, but I follow it from personal interest and experience. If you're looking for a role model, you'll remember about 3 years ago there was an issue in Flint, Michigan with lead.
Yeah.
Everybody knows about that. There's your role model. What did they do? They collected data. They got data from a variety of sources. When you've got a collection of harmful data, then approach the legislature with, this is really bad. What I've heard tonight is that there's a bunch of dead bees. That's a red flag. They're very sensitive. What else is there? People are complaining about illness. Collect that information. So as a result of this meeting, I suggest you get an organization going that's going to collect the data, assemble the data, and approach the legislature with what you'd like to have done. Otherwise, if you don't have data, they don't care. That's true where I grew up, Michigan. It's true where I came from in New York, and I'm guessing it's true in Nebraska. So that's my piece. Good luck. I continue to follow this. And there you have it.
Thank you. Some of us have talked about the fact that this is a Superfund site, not the AltEn plant, but the munitions plant, and that if this were to develop into something equivalent to that, we would be the only facility in the United States with 2 Superfund sites at the same place. I hope that doesn't happen. Other questions?
I've got a statement.
I was wondering if anybody's got an idea on a watchdog to put out there somehow, because anything they've ever said out there is never right. So somebody's going to have to watch what's going on somehow.
So I would say, you know, if you're going to put a team together in town of folks who will work to collect the data like this gentleman said and push forward with things, that might be something that you could talk about. Obviously, talking to the employees who work there and getting their confidence would go a long way towards answering that question.
I gotta ask a question of everybody here. It sounds like this is a pretty important issue for everyone in this community, am I right?
Yes.
Somebody mentioned Mr. Tinglehoff. With all the masks in this room, I don't know. Is there a county supervisor in this room?
There was.
Was?
He had to leave, there was one here.
Because if it's this important to Saunders County and to Nebraska, where are our representatives during a meeting like this?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And there again, I'm going to say the squeaky wheel gets the grease. You call them up and say, how come you weren't at the meeting?
Right.
Or you show up tomorrow and say, why weren't you at the meeting last night? A lot of good stuff was said. Other questions or comments?
All right, so this isn't so much a question, I guess it could be taken as a question. Cody had mentioned something about AltEn knowingly aware of treated seed, and I know that my wife and other people mentioned the treated seed bag, the label that's on it. And one of the first things that my wife and I noticed is when we read that, excess treated seed may be used for ethanol production only if byproducts are not used for livestock feed and no measurable residue or pesticide remain in ethanol byproduct that are to be used as agronomic products. Which, to me, that says right there, that's from Aceleron, which is a subsidiary of Monsanto, and the date is 2008 to 2016. So if they knew about this, it being even put out on the ground is a violation. And I know that my wife and I did I don't think it cost more than $250 for us to do our test with the University of Iowa, or Iowa State, and we found 7 pesticide residues in our test. And so if at $250 we could find residue, why can't AltEn contribute a minor amount to, before they even start doing this, determine whether it's something that should be done in the first place?
First, they have to pay their taxes.
Well, this would have been back in 2018.
Well,
Actually, 2015, because that's when they started using the treated seed. Is that not correct?
yeah, they didn't pay their taxes in 2018.
Well, but did they start using it in 2015?
Yes.
Okay, so they did it. They started using it in 2015.
AltEn has a long history of not paying their taxes.
Well, should that be the taxpayer's responsibility?
You know, why don't the taxpayers insist that you can't get a conditional use permit if your taxes are delinquent? Or if the taxes on the real estate are delinquent where you want to operate. You can't even apply for the permit until they're paid. How hard would that be?
Yeah.
There are 1,000 other solutions like that that are not very complicated, but nobody's asking the questions and nobody's demanding on it. You make an excellent point.
Well, just to add, I know that when this first started occurring to our dogs, we got a hold of DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality. They said that it was Department of Ag's responsibility. Get a hold of the Department of Ag and they say it's DEQ's responsibility. So then you start talking to some lawyers and they don't want to touch it. I talked to several lawyers in Omaha and Lincoln and they wouldn't return my call. And so at what point in time do I get exhausted and say, I mean, I can do this day in and day out, but if I'm not getting any feedback.
You know, I'm going to tell you, if you read a lot about environmental disasters around the country, I'm thinking of a book I read a few years ago about a case in Boston where children were showing up with leukemia. Mother kind of sorted things out and figured out that maybe this was dealt with a chemical dump that had gone along the side of the river. Took years to work through that, and finally some of these families were compensated for their losses, the loss of their loved ones, their little children. All these things take years. I'm sorry to tell you that, it's just the way it is. And the only way you move forward is you be a bulldog and you just stick with it and stick with it and stick with it.
Okay, well, and for everyone who's up in front here, I do want to thank you all for what you've done and what you continue to do. And I guess any support we can provide to the citizens, that's what we'll have to do.
Okay. And so much of it is in your hands. I just hate to say that, but it really is. Because you're the folks that can make it happen. Other questions?
Yes, my question's for Jody. These gentlemen that wouldn't listen to her the other day at the courthouse, are they elected officials or are they appointed?
Can you repeat your question to the mic?
Okay, the gentleman you were talking to concerning that permit at the courthouse, are they elected or are they appointed?
In the planning commission, they're appointed.
They're appointed, okay, because I was going to say, if they're elected, the Mead residents need to get out and vote differently, no matter what.
Tomorrow they're elected. You've
Okay.
got to be there tomorrow.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Jody.
Thanks.
Real quick, as a planning board member and appointed, I'm accountable technically to the town board, I'm guessing Saunders County would be similar, that chewing their butts, you know, at the planning is not sufficient. There should be additional pressure brought to bear.
Did everybody hear what he had to say? And I hate to keep interrupting, but because we have this Facebook Live thing, you're a planning commission member for the city of Mead,
Yes.
and your suggestion was talk to the planning commission, is that correct?
No, not only the planning commission, but the county board.
Talk to the county board, talk to the planning
Because
commission.
they are.
And Lisa's going to ask a question here.
Do you understand that you are going to hear a conditional use permit application from from Mead Cattle Company
Well, I'm hoping so.
at the 26th of April? Because that portion of the feedlot that was annexed into Mead, they have to have a CUP for that as well.
I'm the secretary there. I will make sure that there aren't any missed points.
Next question.
Well, once again, this is Randy Rupert with Nebraska Communities United. Not a question, but earlier this year, we, along with some other partners, developed what is termed the Watchful Citizen Program. And the whole essence of it is for people to monitor water quality above and below CAFOs. I'm extending our program to you, that if it can be applied to all the people in this room that want to participate in monitoring, and we collate the information, and we're starting to get a pretty good chart of water pollution in eastern Nebraska. But this is why we started Watchful Citizen Program, just so the citizens can take charge of their lives again and try and get some of this back. So if you go to our website, it's right there, big bold letters, Watchful Citizen Program, and we can tailor it to work on this issue. So that's what we're here for. That's why we started this in 2015. Without communities, we have nothing.
So I just slipped over here and asked Mr. Domin a question about the CUP and the authority that they may have, and I'd like to just have him talk a little bit about that, if that's okay.
So CUP is an acronym, of course, for Conditional Use Permit. And what it means is that someone who has a piece of property and wants to use it for a land use purpose that doesn't fit within the four corners of the existing zoning requirements, generally, some other land use requirements sometimes, asks for permission to use it on select conditions and then get an exemption. That's a conditional use permit. What is very seldom thought about is that the authority to grant that permit can also be conditioned. So, for example, there is absolutely no reason why a taxing authority asked to approve tax increment financing can't include in the bond, you're in default if you don't stay current with all your obligations to our political subdivisions in our county. A conditional use permit could default if there's no current taxes. You could say, we're not going to consider your conditional use permit until the taxes on that piece of property that you want to use are current, and your authority to use the permit expires if you default on them. You could have a renewal provision that isn't 25 or 30 years, but is 5 years. You could impose a requirement for a cleanup bond. You can require a dismantling plan for whatever it is they're going to build. Almost every major city in the United States requires a dismantling plan if you're going to build a major building in their inner core now. Maybe a 50-year building, but they want to know how to take it down. So in 50 years, they don't have to try to figure it out. They've got a set of plans. All of those things can be done. They can be done in Saunders County by Saunders County's commissioners. It can be done in Mead by Mead's governing council. Are you a village or a city of the second class? Village, by your village board. You can, all of those are tremendous powers that local government has if you're just willing to wield them. Now, the one thing that takes that usually the rich guy has over the other guy is a pen. So you get something that somebody else wrote to start with. You have to take the pen first if you can and write out what you want. Write out what your conditions are. Somebody else can edit it and make it better, but you can't start with a blank piece of paper. And you can't leave having spoken without something on paper when you leave. Just really important basic things.
Any other questions or comments?
I've been involved in a few situations where citizen science is applied. You guys can be our eyes on the ground in some very helpful ways. It's going to take some organization, but you're in a better situation to report than any of us can do. And I know that that's an aim of the committee, the investigative committee is to enlist you, but it's amazing what a group effort like that can do, because it's like neighborhood watch. But in this way, providing us the right information. So maybe we can come up with here's what we'd like to hear back from you guys if you see this, this, and this. Just sort of a checklist. It doesn't have to be anything real complicated. It doesn't have to take a lot of time out of your lives. But it could be really important because you can cover a lot more ground than we can.
So I had a couple of questions that somebody emailed me. I'm going to read these, and then I think these are science questions. I've read the incineration of the corn mash has resulted in additional pesticides being released in the air, as well as still being present in the incinerated matter. How can this waste be dealt with safely? You have an answer?
I think there's not enough known to really kind of inform us at this point at how to safely remove the waste and even the biochar or the emissions. So I think at this point it's kind of premature because we don't know where these contaminants are and at what levels. They could be in the air, they could be in the surface water, the groundwater, the soil, the vegetation, likely all of these, but not consistently throughout the environment. So in hot spots or in areas located where the soil was applied or the wet cake was applied or where the waterways are. So it is going to take some time. In terms of the air emissions, there could be air emissions or residues shown up in the biostacks. It could be dusting off from the wet cake piles itself when it dries out. It could also be just normal functioning of the facilities when they're moving seed bags in and out of operation in the hoop houses. So there's still a lot of point sources that these contaminants can be coming from. So that's kind of where the research stands, is we can't give you a lot of answers because we don't know where those toxins are. But I would like to piggyback off of Dr. Zalesky's comment about citizen science. We do have that website designed to engage with you guys, and as our plans start to develop more, we will be soliciting for your help. Farmers who are interested in finding out the impacts on their soil and their water and their land, reach out to us and we will try to be able to figure out how we can get to your sites and sample. We can't commit to sampling everybody's, but we certainly can start to engage in those conversations to figure out if you are at high risk of those contaminants or not. And that would include not just the farmers in this impacted area, but also for those of you who have domestic animals or livestock or other concerns, reach out to the research community. The UNMC website is going to have a lot more updated information. I just want you guys to just be aware, you and I have been dealing with this for years. We have seen and struggled with this for a long, long time. But most of our research recruits and the UNMC group and all of these really, really awesome think tank people have just become aware of it since January. So this is incredibly rapid pace in terms of research response. So, you know, we really, really value this concern and your community response and your engaging with you guys. So please keep that up and have a little patience with us, because we are still trying to sort through this complicated, very complex issue. But we do want to give you answers as soon as we can. Thank you.
Just a reminder, all of us are collectively going to try to use our organizational power to visit with people that we know at the EPA, the Department of Ag, etc. We will keep you updated. There was sign-in sheets when you first came in, so make sure that you put your email and your cell phone on there so we can create a separate email list to email you updates of things that we're finding out. So if we talk to folks at the EPA and Department of Ag at the federal level, and they can come visit with all the great work that everybody's doing on the ground, that's how we'll be able to update you. Bold, Nebraska, Interfaith Power and Light, Sierra Club, League of Women Voters, lots of groups are here to help, right? They were all the groups that helped initially with Keystone to protect the land and water there, and I don't see this as any different, a big corporation taking advantage of good people.
Right, I really appreciate everybody who's here, but I'm wondering how many people from Mead are here? Would you stand up if you're from Mead? Okay. So, I actually live outside of Mead's proper boundaries, however. So I really don't know, is there anybody here from the village board? Okay, so, you know, it's real easy to get on our supervisors, but your village board members aren't even here. Okay, so that's where you got to start. But we did have and I'm going to give him credit, our Mead's supervisor, Craig, was here earlier. He had to leave, he just had cataract surgery, and he had to drive home before it got dark. So I'm going to give him credit for being here, and thank him for that. But what I want to say is, you know, you can write a letter to President Biden, and one of you can decide to run for supervisor next time around. And one of you could possibly get elected. Or you could run for the NRD board. NRD board's not been cooperative in this at all. And that's an elected position. So there are all kinds of things we can do. And one of the frustrating things, even as a pastor, I'm asking people to get involved. It's just time to, this isn't going to change unless somebody stands up and says, I'll put my name on the line. And everybody else says, okay, I'll support you. I appreciate you guys getting tired. You know how you don't get tired if there were actually a group of people fighting. I've walked beside Jody for this for 6 years, and she's gotten tired, and I drove her to Lincoln and sat through boards and sat through unicameral things and stuff just to support her, because I think she's definitely called to this. But, you know, even though a lot of the room is from Mead, how many of you know somebody that's not here? And why are there even empty seats here? So I think we have to really talk to our neighbors, and we have to talk, and maybe some of your spouses aren't here, and you can forgive that, but I don't want you to go home and get in trouble. But, you know, we really have something to do, and if we don't, thank you for saying it, if we don't do it and persist, it's not going to get done. It's just, how many of you are tired of looking to the government to solve your problems? Well, here's your prime opportunity to do it yourself. So let's just do it ourselves. And Jody, can I call on you? I'll get you a piece of paper and a pen. And when the Mead people walk out, if you'll join the committee, the group that's going to get put together to stop this, you're going to sign your name on there, give her an email, one you'll answer. Not an old one, you don't check. Give her a phone number so you can get text messages, and then we will start. Right? Okay, thanks.
Pastor, that's a great point. A great point. I think it's a great point for us to end on tonight. Thank you so much for coming. There are a lot of people that are on your side. Just remember that. We'll help as much as we can, and we'll help this local effort get going. So, Jody, be ready out there with the pen and paper. Thank you so much.
When you get tired of it. I don't think I've heard very well. God bless you.